So a lot of the time I tend to see kind of weird takes about Japan from people of all political persuasions on the internet, and to me it seems like it's often based in utilizing the country as some kind of example to further whatever political beliefs people might have, usually more towards the conservative side. Probably the most noteworthy example of this is Pigeon Speaks, a YouTuber who is an immigrant in Japan that makes quite a few videos within this realm, though it's not the only thing he does. But a lot of the time it's just using the same kind of points though with a different subject each time, so in some cases talking about one video can effectively mean talking about all of them, or most of them maybe. Basically, my aim here is to use this as an example of other videos by this man as well as similar videos by other people, as a lot of people make comparable arguments when it comes to this subject. And I'll just say, I don't think they're very good most of the time. But let's go into our specific example here to make it more clear what I'm talking about. So this video is about Pope Francis going to Japan last year and proclaiming that Japan should take in more refugees, which resulted in a backlash from Japanese Twitter users. So surely, this means that since Japanese people complained about this on Twitter, that this means I can conclude that Japanese people just hate refugees and be done with the topic of this video, right? No. There's a few reasons for why using Twitter as a metric to measure opinion as well as the way this video explains this aren't the most reliable ways of going about it.
Do that first in the Vatican, wrote one Japanese Twitter user, which was liked by 15,000 people and retweeted almost 5,000 times.
The argument here, of course, being that since a lot of people were mad about a thing on Twitter, that this means that this is the common thing to believe in terms of people from Japan. And even if, yes, he didn't really say that this was his conclusion, many of the other points he makes are based on this idea basically, so this is definitely the argument that you should believe that because Twitter people were mad about a thing, that this says something about the overall attitude of people of the country, considering no other evidence was given. First, I'll just say that I would never see someone from America claiming that, after seeing some Americans complaining about a thing on Twitter, that means that this is the common opinion of Americans to complain about this particular thing. Almost nobody would ever make this implication or say this about a country that they live in, as they know that even within their own city or town, there will be a lot of disagreements on political issues. So purely, this is an outside looking in sort of thing, basing your perception on a large group of people on the few small glimpses of opinions you get from that group. You could say that since I'm talking about people misinterpreting things of other cultures, that it doesn't apply in this instance since we're talking about someone who actually lives in that culture, just that they weren't born there. However, I don't exactly trust immigrants to always see a culture they weren't born in from a non-ethnocentric standpoint, even if they have lived in that culture for a while, to the point that I would say that they generally are less reliable as an unbiased gauge of the entire culture than someone who was born there, but at the same time they could be significantly less biased than someone born there on average. It really differs wildly from person to person because immigrants just tend to have unique perspectives like that. Regardless, he's delivering this message to people who are almost entirely not from Japan, so they will more readily accept this perspective of his due to their lack of knowledge and experience on what he's talking about, as large amounts of people being told a thing is generally the most significant factor when it comes to media. However, let's get into what was actually said by Pope Francis as well as the response to what he said. If you look at the Japanese article cited by the Twitter account stating, "Do that in the Vatican first," you'll see that all that was being said by Pope Francis was that Japan should be more generous to refugee applicants as well as some other emotional encouragement speech stuff about how people who hate refugees are kind of bullies. However, this is not how Pigeon Speaks framed it.
Pope Francis has for years advocated for open borders in the West, urging Christians to overcome their fears of mass immigration and their fears of migrants in particular. So prior to these statements urging Japan to open its borders to the world, the Pope was actually received quite warmly by the Japanese public. But as the Pope began to preach to the Japanese that they should adopt the one-size-fits-all globalist experiment in multiculturalism and demographic transformation via mass immigration, well, the response to Francis, at least on social media, turned decidedly negative.
Based on what I found, there is no evidence that the Pope ever claimed Japan should become an open borders nation, and I've yet to see any political or religious figure in the mainstream claim that anyone should do this. It just seems like a way to flanderize things to make the claims of people seem more ridiculous than they actually are, so that they are more easy to attack and ridicule, basically. And yes, the Pope is absolutely right that Japan should accept more refugees, as they are violating the international refugee policy that they have accepted in the current way that they deal with refugees. The reason for this is because Japan tends to define what is acceptable acceptable as a refugee in their country if the specific applicant is being pursued in some manner rather than them just being the result of some kind of war or distraught forcing a large number of people to move. Obviously, this is going to end in very few people approved as refugees, and there are Japanese Twitter users calling for support of refugees as well, claiming that their own nation is an embarrassment for not doing what it should be doing. Still, I don't find Twitter research to be a good way to conclude information about the overall opinions of the public, and this is for a number of reasons. First, there are obviously more succinct, deliberate attempts to gather public opinion, and we'll get into that in a bit. Also being that Twitter on its own is a place where only people who use the site consistently have a voice there, so it's cutting off a large proportion of the population that doesn't use it. Second, in general, people tend to respond more strongly to things they dislike than things they are okay with. For example, on Amazon, you'll tend to find that people are more likely to go out of their way to state they had a negative experience with something. People more towards the positive or neutral tend to have less strong feelings, as the general attitude is satisfaction with products, otherwise they probably wouldn't be functional and on the shelves. So generally, people are more likely to express their feelings on something if they had an overwhelmingly positive or negative association with it. So it's safe to say that a lot of people who were fine with what the Pope said were like, okay, and moved on because they just saw this as a normal thing perhaps, but then people who really didn't like this would have been more likely to go onto Twitter or wherever to express their distaste, since in their eyes things were moving away more from what they think is right, so they have to do something about it to bring it back, whereas the people who agreed didn't, as the Pope was clearly taking action in their favor. So when we're looking at this backlash, even though it's relatively large, we're only selecting for a specific group of people that not only used Twitter, but viewed the event negatively and also cared enough to express this opinion of theirs on the internet. Another thing to note here is that, say for example, a religious leader from Asia, such as the Dalai Lama, went to Germany and proclaimed that Germany should be more open to refugees. Just assume that this was before the big refugee controversy, I suppose. Do you think that the foreignness of him in Germany would have an impact on the reaction there? I absolutely think so. I believe that the negative reaction in Japan may have been strengthened by the origin of the speaker, since the Pope is foreign to Japanese people. I think people in America would be more susceptible to Trump telling them that they should stay inside to hold back the virus than if Macron said that Americans should do the same thing. A lot of the time, people don't like being told to do things from people they consider part of the outgroup. But still, the main thing is that Twitter likes cannot tell you the overall opinion based on a controlled number of people who were asked a question, as it's just whoever happens to present themselves on Twitter at any given time, meaning that the max number of respondents is not controlled. Anyway, do Japanese people actually hate refugees? Does this Twitter backlash exemplify the common populace? The short answer is no. But I'll show you the evidence behind this so you have an actual reason to believe me. This Pew Research poll asks people in various countries if they support taking in refugees. The reason that this in particular is more reliable than Twitter is because it is a controlled survey with a specific number of responses, meaning we can directly measure what percentage of people agreed or disagreed with a certain question, and because surveys generally control better for the wider population in terms of gender, age, and so on, rather than just using a specific demographic, which it's safe to say that Twitter is toward the younger side generally. The results of this show that the support for taking in refugees in Japan is a bit lower than the EU median for this, but a majority of people in Japan still support taking in refugees, with countries such as South Africa, Russia, Israel, Hungary, Poland, and Italy having significant lower support than Japan, and Japan having about the same support as countries like Greece and the United States. So let's look at another study just for further reference. The Asahi Shimbun made a similar study specifically in Japan about this topic earlier this year and found similar results, though they provide different answers and metrics. It was taken with 3,000 Japanese adults, with 54% of them stating that they believe the number of refugees in Japan is low, and 10.6% stating that they believe it's high. In a separate question, it was found that 56% of respondents think the country should be careful before deciding whether to accept more refugees in the future or not, and 24% said that they should actively accept more refugees in the future. The remainder apparently was undecided, but there doesn't seem to be an answer indicating overall denial of refugees either way. So you could claim that this is a bit unreliable since it doesn't provide an answer for people against refugees altogether, but both of these answers still show approval for refugees, just one states to exercise caution and the other is less cautious. And also, a majority still believe the number of refugees is low. Of course, there is also the argument that Japan simply hasn't taken in enough refugees yet to have an accurate opinion on this. However, based on comparisons between other countries, this criticism doesn't seem to make any sense consistently. As you'll see here, Poland and Hungary both have similarly insignificant refugee numbers numbers as Japan while having far lower opinions on them. There's also the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, France, and the United Kingdom on here, all which have a slightly higher opinion of refugees than Japan, while all also having hundreds of times as much the per capita refugee population as Japan. Not to mention that Sweden has one of the top 10 highest per capita refugee populations in the world, while also having the 4th highest opinion of refugees on this list. So I think it's reasonable to say that the number of refugees in a particular place does not appear to directly decide the public opinion on them. Another point made here by Black Pigeon Speaks is that Japan is not Christian, therefore it does not hold the same moral values as European countries.
And the one thing, despite all of the differences between the countries in the Western world, is the historical commonality of Christianity, whether that be Protestant or Catholic. And now, even today, in the post-Christian West, the social morals as they are derived from Christianity, of guilt, charity, compassion, among many others, have transferred themselves upon the newly emergent cult of radical social justice. Among many other tweets, I think it was this tweet by @NoProblem666 that properly diagnoses the failure of Pope Francis to understand that Japan is not Western, nor does it hold the same cultural values rooted in Christianity as the post-Christian West does currently. Has a very unique culture that has a very different view of the world and their place in it. It's also very important to point out that the country is not dominated by Christian, nor is Christianity even a force within Japan. Also, for the most part, the country eschews organized religion for the most part, along with mysticism, in favor of cultural adherence to traditional spiritual practices.
At least within the context of this specific subject, this seems to absolutely not be true, as Hungary, Poland, Italy, South Africa, and Russia are all majority Christian nations while still being more in opposition to refugees than Japan. Furthermore, other Christians have criticized the actions of the Pope before for serving Muslim-catered meals at times, claiming he rejects all that is Christian or Western. So it seems like you can't really say that the factor causing people to be more or less open to these things is related to any particular religion based on the evidence that we have.
It is a culture that is not built upon guilt, but of shame. Shame of the individual and the family and the temporal actions that break social harmony, rather than that of spiritual or ideological belief systems. I can also say, just from personal experience, the idea of unlimited forgiveness as espoused in Christianity is a concept that pretty much everyone that I've ever talked to in the country doesn't seem to be able to get their head around. Charity for the outgroup is also an alien concept to most.
He then goes on to make some vague emotional speech about how Japan doesn't care about the things that the West does, only he provides no actual research or statistics to back this up, so I guess that was a nice explanation of his own personal feelings at least.
Most Japanese aren't able to just unsee or disregard patterns, and that's because human beings are pattern recognition machines. And non-Westerners, and in the Orient in particular, cannot so easily turn off their senses, turn off their intuition, turn off their accrued knowledge and lived experiences using either religious belief or ideological dogma in the same way that many, if not the majority, in the West are able to do. In the Orient, people believe with their eyes and ears rather than the conclusions of utopian ideologies.
Then he goes on to say that Japanese people just can't turn off their intuition like Western people can, which is just a way to say they believe in the right things in some kind of emotional manner, I guess. I could just as easily give an emotional speech about how, in my experience, Japanese people are caring and hospitable to the outsider and cannot easily turn down people in need, and it would be equally correct as I would just be giving anecdotal emotional evidence as Black Pigeon Speaks is. There would be no reason to believe either of us more than the other. But for what it's worth, I guess I will provide an anecdote on this, and this is an anecdote, I admit. My father, visiting me for a few days in Japan, dropped his wallet either somewhere on the train or at the airport, to which whoever found it took it to the lost and found at whatever train station they were at, and we were able to get his wallet back by going to the lost and found at the nearest large station. I could never imagine something like this is common in America or Europe, and I've been told by other Japanese people that this isn't that uncommon in Japan, which is again based on the anecdotes of the specific people I've talked to. So there, for my emotional perception of a large group of people, I at least gave an example, despite it being mostly anecdotal. And even then, his description of differences that Japanese people have compared to European people could on its own be seen as a racist view of white people, which is kind of weird that he would do this considering his apparent preference for white people as evidenced by other points made in this video.
Who has never seen a geopolitical situation that could not be remedied by massive emigration to the West and the redistribution of its wealth to the rest of the world. This Pope for the cause of woke has now ventured to the East and is advocating for Japan to also become a destination for the billions upon billions of people that wish to move to countries with advanced economies. But for good or ill, people have been told for decades that immigration cannot be controlled, that demographic transformation of their countries and cities is inevitable, and that hyperdiversity and a population that has nothing in common with each other in terms of cultural norms, religious beliefs, and social traditions, well, that is a strength. They have been told the more divergent the people that are living within the same geographical area are, the better off that society will be. This experiment is being played out from Sydney to San Francisco, from Boston to Berlin, and from Los Angeles to London.
But obviously, he's just talking about specific white people he disagrees with that he's making this negative claim about, as there are obviously white people who think the same as him that he wouldn't claim do this most likely. So as I said earlier, he's able to recognize people in his own group having different opinions, but he doesn't seem quite as aware in that for Japanese people. The mistake being made here is obviously that, like all other groups of people, Japanese people are not monolithic in their opinions, as they will have completely different takes on things depending on who you ask. He seems to ignore the possibility entirely that there are a large amount of Japanese people who disagree with him, and apparently this seems to be most of them. I would assume that viewing opinions as something highly divergent on an individual basis to be an obvious thing to take into account, but perhaps to someone who is, you know, not the most perceptible to people outside of their culture, this might be a difficult thing to fathom. So essentially, it seems like this entire video would not really be a good argument if you were not already a viewer of this particular channel or were not in the know with similar channels that make similar arguments, as no actual data is presented, a bunch of emotionally loaded language is used to make other points with no evidence, and the entire basis by which the video makes any sense hinges upon inferring that some tweets people made somehow indicate the positions of an entire country. So that's quite pathetic if you ask me.